everybody. So today is the video for Tuesday, November 3rd, and I will look right at our course schedule. So what we're working on today is continuing revising and drafting and making a final revisions plan for the CTA. Now, please note that the CTA draft is due on this Thursday, and we will be beginning peer review and finish peer review over the weekend. And then we will have next Tuesday to make final revisions and final changes. And then the final draft of the CTA is due on Thursday, November 12th on midnight through Dropbox on Blackboard. So anyway, you can find the link to today's lesson right in our syllabus, and it is the CTA Final Revisions Checklist, and I will also show you where to find it. So under the Lessons tab, I have it uploaded as the CTA Final Revisions Checklist, and that is the lesson that I will be going over today. And again, the homework is to just continue drafting, finish drafting, continue working on the CTA or the third paper. So this lesson will act as a guide of what to look for in your draft and help with final revisions and proofreading before peer review. So this lesson talks quite a bit about proofreading. So why is proofreading important? So why proofread? It's the content that really matters, right? Now, while content, of course, is important, but the way a paper looks affects the way others judge it, and it especially leaves a first impression on your reader. So when you've worked hard to develop and present your ideas, you don't want careless errors distracting your reader from what you have to say. It's worth paying attention to the details that help you make a good impression. Most people devote only a few minutes to proofreading, hoping to catch any glaring errors that jump out from the page. But a quick and cursory reading, especially after you've been working long and hard on a paper, usually misses a lot. So it's better to work with a definite plan that helps you to search systematically for specific kinds of errors. And while this might take a little extra time, it does pay off in the end. If you know that you have an effective way of how to catch these errors when the paper is almost finished, you can worry less about editing while you are writing your first drafts. And of course, one of our course goals is how to make the entire writing process more efficient. So a few tips on proofreading. Now it's important to keep in mind that while spell checkers are very useful, you cannot rely on them solely. They are far from foolproof. So spell checkers have limited dictionaries, so some words that show up as misspelled may really just not be in their memory. So in addition, spell checkers will not only catch misspellings that form another valid word. So for example, if you type your instead of your, or to instead of to, or there instead of there, the spell checker won't catch that error, and it really depends on the context of the sentence of which word is correct in that case. So grammar checkers are great too. I use Grammarly quite a bit for work sometimes, but again, it's really important to sort of use your common sense. You can't rely on it entirely. So these programs work with limited numbers of rules, so they can't identify every error and sometimes often make mistakes, and that it's really up to you to catch those mistakes. And it's important to proofread because if you have grammar mistakes, especially in your final portfolio, it might leave the reader with a poor impression. So that's why it's so important to proofread and catch those errors yourself. And you definitely want to get into the habit of that before going into Comp 2 next semester. And they sometimes also fail to give thorough explanations to help you understand why a sentence should be revised. So you might want to use a grammar checker to help you identify potential run-on sentences or too frequent use of passive voice, but you need to be able to evaluate the feedback it provides. And that's really my main point there. Now, it might also be helpful to proofread for only one kind of error at a time. If you try to identify and revise too many things at once, you risk losing focus and your proofreading might become less effective. So it's easier to catch grammar errors if you aren't checking punctuation and spelling at the same time. So in addition, some of the techniques that work well for spotting one kind of mistake might not catch others. Now, it's really up to you what works for you, and that is really an important part of comp is finding what works for you in terms of proofreading, drafting, the whole process. Because now one technique might work for a visual learner, and another type of learner might be a auditory learner. So the same technique might not always work for the same student. It differs from student to student based on their needs and whatever might need improvement in terms of their writing. So of course, I am fully encouraging you take the time to find what works for you. So anyway, another technique that might help, and I used to do this quite a bit at St. Bonaventure when I was working at the Writing Center. I would sit down with students and tutor them with their papers. I would help them with their papers. That was part of my graduate program. I enjoyed it immensely. It is what steered me in the direction of becoming a composition professor. So this is something that I used to do quite a bit often with my students, especially in the Writing Center. So sometimes it helps to read slow and read every word. Try reading your paper out loud because sometimes it will force you to say each word and also lets you hear how the words sound together. So if you read the paper out loud, you might catch mistakes when you're reading out loud versus when you're just sitting and reading it. And again, that really depends on learning style of student, how they best respond to that kind of thing. But more often than not, when I would sit down with my students at the Writing Center, more often than not, they would catch their errors more efficiently, or at least a little bit easier when reading their papers out loud. And then they would catch grammar mistakes that way. Now, another thing that might help is separating the text into individual sentences. So this is another technique to help you read every sentence carefully. Simply press the return key after every period so that every line begins a new sentence. So what that is if you're working with a printed copy of the paper, which more often than not, working with a printed copy of your draft really does help in terms of catching grammar errors or proofreading. So what this is talking about is if you're working with a printed copy, try using an object like a ruler or a piece of paper to isolate line by line what you're reading. And what that does is that it helps visual learners catch grammar mistakes a little bit easier. It's helpful in terms of breaking down the paper, being able to read line by line, and then that way you're not distracted by the rest of the paper. And I have done that with students too. If I see that that is what works for them, because that way they don't get distracted by the rest of the paper. They're able to read line by line and sort of catch their mistakes a little bit easier that way. So another thing that might help is circling every punctuation mark, especially if you're working with a printed copy when proofreading. And I do recommend working with a printed copy when you're proofreading. Especially if you find yourself sort of struggling reading on a screen sometimes. Sometimes it helps to just print out the paper and sit down for 10 or 15 minutes and taking that extra time to proofread. So this forces you to look at every punctuation mark as you circle, ask yourself if the punctuation is correct. Now I have seen this technique a little bit less frequently than the other ones, but I have seen students use all of these or a combination of all of these. Again, it's really dependent on what works for you. But this particular technique is helpful for checking spelling. Now, if you're someone that really struggles with spelling or that kind of thing, so start with the last word on the last page and work your way back to the beginning, reading each word separately. Because content, punctuation, and grammar won't make any sense, your focus will be on the spelling of each word. So that's why this technique is geared particularly towards spelling. You can also read backwards sentence by sentence to check grammar. This will help you avoid becoming distracted by content issues. So again, it's really about tailoring and finding what works for you. Proofreading, just like the rest of the learning process, is a learning process. And we all have to start somewhere. Uh, I had to start somewhere many years ago, when I was back in grad school. I was just a little freshman, and I remember, uh, learning this stuff from, and grad school definitely changed my life in terms of that. Again, it's really just a changing process. It's a learning process. It's finding what works for you. So you're not just looking for errors that you recognize, you're also learning to recognize and correct new errors. This is where handbooks and dictionaries come in. Keep the ones you find helpful close at hand as you proofread. Now, in terms of that, sometimes looking back at review materials, especially for our course, is very helpful. So it's okay to look back at previous videos of mine. Looking at the two textbooks is, of course, an excellent resource. And even just taking a look at previous lessons that I have given and that are still available on our Blackboard page can be very helpful in terms of review. So using all the resources that you have at hand can be very helpful. Now, between the two textbooks, I would say the textbook that is a bit more useful for proofreading is the Little Seagull Handbook, and that talks quite a bit about sentence structure, grammar, how to proofread, that kind of thing. So while ignorance may be bliss, it won't make you a better proofreader. And of course, we're trying to improve writing here. I mean, that is the basis of our course here. So you'll often find things that don't seem quite right to you, but you're not quite sure what's wrong either. A word looks like it might be misspelled, but the spell checker didn't catch it. Or, and in many cases, I find a lot of students struggle with comma usage. So you think you need a comma between two words, but you're not sure why. Should you use that instead of which? If you're not sure about something, look it up. Use your resources at hand. So the proofreading process becomes more efficient as you develop and practice a systematic strategy. And of course, that takes time, so you have to be patient with yourself. It's not something that changes overnight. This is something that you'll be practicing throughout your career at college, or even if you choose to dive into a new career. This is something that takes time. But of course, for our purposes for Comp 1 and 2, it's really developing and practicing a systematic strategy throughout the semester and seeing what you can change and better for your own writing process. So you'll learn to identify the specific areas of your own writing that need careful attention, and knowing that you have a sound method for finding errors that will help you focus more on developing your ideas while you're drafting the paper. So this is what to be looking for within your draft, and this is taken right directly. This is a summary of the third paper guidelines or the CTA guidelines. So what you want to be looking for is when you're sitting down and proofreading your draft and also revising it, you want to consider, is the thesis statement present? Does your introduction discuss the various sources from your topic cluster? You also want to take a look at topic sentences and supporting reasons within your body paragraphs. Are they logically organized and coherent? How is the overall structure of your paper? How is the style and tone of your paper? Take a look at grammar and sentence structure. How is your conclusion? It should be more than just a restatement of your main argument. And lastly, have you correctly formatted and included in-text citations and a works cited page for your sources? Now, what to be looking for in terms of your thesis, and again, this is all taken directly right from the guidelines. So I won't read the whole thing, but I will at least give you a summary of what your thesis statement should be like. So by now you should be tentatively versed in looking at arguments and deciding whether or not you agree with them based on ethical, pathetic, and logical appeals, or ethos, logos, pathos. Your task is to align yourself with some of the speakers in the conversation. Furthermore, your readers will want to know that you are advancing the conversation, turning it in a new direction, rather than just repeating another writer's argument. Now, in terms of the evidence and body paragraphs, you should have at least 3 main supporting reasons, one or more direct quotes from each of your sources, including in-text citations. Now, I have talked about quotation sandwiches, how to introduce, quote, and respond to those direct quotes. So if you need a review of that stuff, it can be found in the previous lessons on Blackboard. And of course, the main purpose of the paper is, of course, comparing and contrasting the sources from your topic cluster. And lastly, the third body paragraph should focus on your own position. Now, in terms of organization and structure, I have talked quite a bit in detail about structure. Ultimately, you want to organize your paper in the manner that you think will prove most effective with your audience, but here are a couple of tips. So to give your writing the most important thing of all, namely a point, a writer needs to indicate clearly not only their thesis, but also what larger conversation that thesis is responding to. So in this case, the conversation you're responding to is the one constituted by the articles in your topic cluster. And if you want, you can try out a few different ways to organize through a few different rough outlines. And lastly, the style. So again, you are responsible for maintaining your own ethos, logos, and pathos. So unlike your first paper, imagine this paper will be written for publication and for readers you don't know. Thus, you should adopt a more formal style and tone and definitely proofread, please. Especially for that second faculty reader that will be taking a look at your portfolio. You definitely want to make sure you proofread all your papers before posting them to your final portfolio. Now, of course, you want to try to evoke emotions, that's for pathos appeal, and appeal to values that you share with your audience. Now, if you need further help, you can refer to past lessons, the paper guidelines, and the textbook. And I have the link to the CTA guidelines right within our lesson here, and also the CTA sample paper. Now, if you're still feeling stuck and haven't begun writing the paper yet, and you need some extra time or some extra help, you can make an appointment online to meet with a writing tutor from JCC's Learning Center. And if you click on that link, it will take you right directly to this page, and it will tell you how to make an appointment with a tutor if you really need some extra help. Or you're welcome to stop in during my office hours. I have office hours on Fridays from 3 to 5 p.m. Anyway, that is it for today's lesson. But yeah, if you would like an appointment during office hours this week, I have office hours available. I have no appointments booked yet. So I have office hours this Friday from 3 to 5 p.m. So if you would like an appointment, you're welcome to email me, and I'm sure we can work something out. Anyway, I hope you all have a great day, and thank you so much.